Hello, history nerds and historians. My name is Krystina, and this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history that's super fucked up. Happy Pride Month, babies! Even though it's the end of it, because life, we'll talk about it. So, last year for Pride Month, I talked about the Stonewall riots and sort of just like a brief history of the LGBTQIA plus history of everything. It was very brief, not at all inclusive of everything, but sort of like all the big events that happened because of the Pride movement or for the Pride movement and all of that. And then after that, I did a follow-up episode where I talked about like some of the biggest icons from the Stonewall riots, which were Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera and Stormy DeLavier. And I really, really enjoyed talking about them. And last year, I had it on my list that I wanted to do another really revolutionary icon from LGBTQIA history. And honestly, I just like didn't get the chance to get around to it last year. So today we're going to talk about Edie Windsor. And so a couple things before we start. So I do want to say I was intending on releasing this episode a couple weeks ago, not just like come in right at the end of Pride Month and be like, here's the obligatory Pride story. I was planning on doing this 2 weeks ago and then finishing up the last couple episodes of the Tudor series so that we can just like get on with our lives and be done with it already, because it's already taking much longer than I thought it was going to. And additionally, I was also trying to make sure that I was like publishing an episode every week. And starting the first week of January up until 2 weeks ago, I was very successful in doing that. But so this past week, the end of the week before actually, I had a death in my family. And that just kind of took precedence over the podcast. It is what it is. So, sorry I didn't get 2 episodes out to you in the last 2 weeks period for anyone who has been waiting. Thank you for your patience. And thanks to everyone who has been listening. If any of you went back to listen to old episodes or any of like my new listeners, I really appreciate it. It's been a difficult week, but we're gonna like get through it and get back to how life goes and all of that. So sad personal stuff aside, I also want to say apologies if my audio is a little weird or a little echoey or anything this week. I usually try and record these podcasts when my son's at school and it's all like nice and quiet and, you know, we can all be very like peaceful and do our thing, minus maybe dogs barking in the background or a car driving by occasionally. And, with just everything that's been happening in my personal life, I didn't have time to do that. So I'm recording this on Sunday, June 26th, while my son is taking a nap. And so that way I can be as loud as I want to / need to be. I am recording this in my walk-in closet. And the irony is not lost on me that I am recording my Pride Month story for this year while in the closet, especially because last year I came out of the closet and now I'm finding myself back in it. So it's just been a weird week. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and practice your oh good God, what the fuck faces. So Edie Windsor was born Edith Schlein on June 20th, 1929 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Her parents were James and Celia, and they were Russian Jewish immigrants. She was born about 2 months before the Great Depression began. So her childhood was rough, and it was made even rougher when Edie and her brother got polio, which led to her father's candy and ice cream store being closed down after it was quarantined. And then, you know, like the stock market crashing. And it was just, everyone was very affected by it. Her parents tried to make sure that the children felt it as little as possible. I read an article where she talks about how her dad used to bring like a single hard-boiled egg sandwich to work, like not egg salad, just like a hard-boiled egg on a piece of bread, to work every day for years so that they could afford to buy like secondhand books so that she could learn how to read and she can be educated and all that kind of stuff, which was really, really cool. And I really loved like that kind of support for her. She recalls growing up with her mom being like very supportive of her dating people and trying to find a husband. She recalled dating boys every Saturday of her life, but had crushes on other girls. But she lived in a time when homosexuality was illegal. During this time in, you know, the 30s and 40s, even into the 50s, all 50 states had sodomy laws. And I think a lot of people think that like sodomy means anal sex and is therefore targeted towards like gay men or just people with penises. But the actual definition of sodomy is anal or oral sex, and the sodomy laws prohibited any form of like non-procreative sex. But if you were in like a heterosexual relationship and engaged in anal or oral sex, you most likely were not what this law or who this law was directed at. It was directed straight towards the LGBTQIA community during this time period. And even more than that, she recalls that she didn't even really know what homosexuality was or what all that entailed. She said, the first time I became aware, I was at a college party with a boy and I was in the kitchen and the hostess came in and said, "Do you have homosexual relations?" And I pulled myself together and I said, on occasion, even though she admits that she had never at this point. So she went to Temple University in Philadelphia beginning in 1946. She studied psychology. One interesting thing that I read that she had a part in was writing a paper about the Kinsey Report. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Kinsey Report was an experiment done by Alfred Kinsey. The first part was done in 1948, which is what Edie wrote about, and that explored sexual behavior in the human male. And then in 1953, it explored sexual behavior in females. So if you've ever heard of the Kinsey scale, of, you know, sexual behavior or sexual attraction or anything like that, it's a result of these experiments. It basically says that people usually are not like just straight or gay, that sexuality is a spectrum. And in the analysis of male sexual behavior that she wrote about, Kinsey found that in this like sample study that he did of 5,300 white men, 37% of these men had had some sort of homosexual experience in their life that resulted in an orgasm, and that 10% of males identified as exclusively homosexual. And this really opened her eyes a lot to the realities of the world and human sexual behavior that she, of course, like I said, claimed that she knew nothing about before this point. While she was in college, she was, you know, still had crushes on girls and stuff, but she was trying to sort of fit into society. And she was dating her brother's friend, Saul Windsor, and they had actually gotten engaged and were planning on getting married after graduation when she fell in love with a classmate who happened to be a woman. And she recalled this relationship being both wonderful and terrible. And she broke off her engagement with Saul. But during that time, she was grappling with sort of just like the realities of the country at that time and the laws and opinions that I've already mentioned about, you know, sodomy laws and homosexuality being illegal and all that stuff. And she decided in 1950 that she wanted to have a quote normal life, and that she didn't want to be a part of the LGBT community. She wanted to just be what she viewed as normal. So she married Saul, even though she didn't love him the way that you should love someone that you marry. She probably loved him in some way, but like not a romantic way, or at least like not romantically enough for them to stay together. And she quoted that like during her marriage to him, that every time she saw two women walking together, she'd be so jealous because she thought that she was never going to be able to do that. But less than a year after their marriage, Edie and Saul divorced. She asked him for the divorce. She recalled that she told him the truth, that she was interested in women and that she just like couldn't be with him anymore. And she said, "Honey, you deserve a lot more. You deserve someone who thinks that you're the best, because you are, and I need something else." And the next year after that, she moved to New York City, where she began a master's in mathematics at NYU. She realized that she didn't want to get married again to a man just to be married because of convenience and because of society. But this was a time when, like post World War II, nuclear family was like really being pushed, and a lot of women became stay-at-home moms and single income family households. And she was never going to do that. So she had to learn how to support herself. When she graduated NYU with her master's in mathematics in 1957, she got a job at IBM and then eventually became a senior systems programmer, which is the highest title that you can reach at that company. And she was still very, very afraid, though, that she was going to be outed, whether by some action that she did or by like someone finding out and revealing her sexual orientation. But she still wanted to be part of the community in some way and like frequented hotspots and watched women dancing together and just longing to be in a relationship like that. And she recalled in one of her interviews where she said, quote, "I hope that I have that when I'm old." So one of the places that she frequented was a place called Portofino in Greenwich Village, which was known as the place where the lesbians go, or the place where the women go, It was a bar only for women. And it was in Greenwich Village, like I said, and was only about 10 minutes away, like a walking distance from the Stonewall Inn, where the later Stonewall riots began. See last year's episodes if you want to know more about that and you don't know anything. And this is where she met Thea Spire in 1963, where they danced all night together, even though that night they were both actually on dates with other people. The article that I read about their relationship said that they just kept dancing together, like even after they put their coats on, while their dates were just like staring at them from the doors, like super upset about the whole situation. Thea Spire was a psychologist. She was born in Amsterdam in 1931. Her family was really, really wealthy, but they were also Jewish. So they fled their home during the Holocaust and came to the United States. They were very lucky to be able to do that because the United States... I think I talked about that in the Ho Feng Shan episode, I think it was, where like the United States was like not helpful towards Jewish people during the Holocaust, and we're just like not wanting to let people in. So the fact that like her family was allowed to get into the United States was very lucky for them, because a lot of people were not lucky enough for that. But Thea was a bit of a firecracker. She played the violin and was like thrown out of Sarah Lawrence for kissing another woman. But one of my favorite things that I read about her that kind of like shows how much of a firecracker she was in the 70s, after the gay rights movement began and like her relationship with Edie had already taken off. There were some gay people that were at this like function that they were at for gay rights, and they didn't like how Thea and Edie divided their relationship into more like traditional masculine and feminine roles, where Thea took on like the more masculine role in the relationship and Edie took on like the more feminine role, because like the people who were around them felt that they should both be feminine, and like not all relationships have that dynamic. Some are both feminine, some are both more masculine, some are kind of neither. They're very fluid. It doesn't really matter like what kind of role you take on in relationship. There's even heterosexual relationships where that's not really the case. Like there are times where I'm married to a man, but there are times when like I'm definitely the more like masculine one in our relationship, and there's nothing wrong with those kinds of relationship dynamics. So with these people saying this to her, she stood on a table in the middle of this gay rights function and shouted at them that if they didn't have room in their movement for her butch and Edie's femme, then you don't have a movement at all. And I love that. It was just so great. A lot of times when you like read about Edie Windsor and Thea Spire, like Edie is the one that's more focused on, because she's the one who, is known more about. And Thea kind of takes a little bit of like a background to the story of Edie and Thea. So I kind of love that we have that little glimpse into her, how much of just like a passionate person that she was. So their relationship got serious in 1965, but the sad thing is that Edie recalled that she was just lying all the time and was distancing herself from her friends and coworkers who didn't know that she was a lesbian because she wasn't going to go to parties or events or like wine tastings or any of those kinds of things alone. And when Thea would call her at work, she would say that it was because she was dating Thea's brother Willie, even though like there was no Willie. And then in 2 years later, in 1967, they moved in together in Greenwich Village, and on Memorial Day weekend, Thea proposed to Edie. But because of society, they still weren't able to get married legally or really like live fully out. And they knew that if they exchanged rings, that people would ask about, like, you know, their fellas or whatever you want to say. And so instead of an engagement ring, Thea gave Edie a diamond circle brooch that she wore every day. And Edie was scared to tell anyone, especially in the field that she was working in, where she could have gotten fired for these kinds of things and for being a lesbian or being a part of a non-heteronormative relationship or anything like that. And she said that even though it was the happiest time of her life, she was scared about everyone else, and like their families didn't really support them. Well, the American family, I read that that Thea's European family supported their relationship, but both of their families in the United States didn't really support their relationship. So they would just like host their own parties with family that they made together, you know, friends and people in their community and all of that knew about them. So in June of 1969, Edie and Thea returned home from a vacation in Italy and found out that like literally the night before, the brick or the shot glass or the shoe or whatever heard around the world was thrown and the Stonewall riots began, and they didn't really get involved in it. If you watch the episode of Drunk History about it, it was very much that portrayed, you know, that she was scared about this and she was scared to be a part of the LGBT riots and the rights movement and all of that, because then it could out her and then people would know, and she was just trying to keep everything a secret. But after Stonewall and seeing everything that was done and realizing the importance of everything, Edie and Thea marched with the Gay Liberation Front. We talked about them a little bit last year because Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera created STAR, which was like the drag queen caucus of GLF. And Edie was really thankful for people like Marsha and Sylvia. She said that early in her life and prior to Stonewall that she didn't really want to be associated with the quote queens and all of that. But then she said she realized that they're human and that they changed her life. And she was very supportive of them after that. Edie eventually took a buyout option from IBM and started her own computer consulting company in the 1970s, and then dedicated her life to lesbian activism. At this point, she didn't have to worry about being fired from her job because she worked for herself, so she could really just devote a lot of her time to this. And she wasn't afraid to show who she really was anymore, but they still had a lot of obstacles to overcome. They were committed to each other, but they weren't permitted to marry, and they didn't have any rights as partners. Like, for example, Edie tried to name Thea as her beneficiary of her IBM pension and was denied for that because they weren't married, even though they had been together for like over 10 years at this point. In 1977, Thea was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, but she didn't let this stop her. She still would see patients. They still threw parties. They were still activists. They still danced. They would change up their dancing style as Thea like got sicker. Edie would start dancing with her by sitting on her lap in her wheelchair. And then when Thea's sickness got to be too much for her, Edie became Thea's sole full-time caregiver. But they still could not get married. And the 80s had that whole like gay panic related to the AIDS epidemic. And in 1988, I read that there was a poll done that showed in the population that they interviewed that represented the country, 57% of Americans thought that gay sex should be illegal altogether. But Edie talked about this in a later interview and said that while the AIDS epidemic was horrible and she lost a lot of her friends, it broke down that final wall that she saw dividing the LGBT community. That Stonewall broke down a lot of it, but that there was still this divide between like the gay and lesbian community. But when gay men started becoming ill with AIDS, She said the lesbians weren't afraid to become like the nurses and that they helped everyone. And although it was horrible, it brought everyone together. And then it seemed like it was a little bit on the upswing when in the 90s, some state and local ordinances were passed that allowed domestic partnership. This happened in New York City in 1993, and Edie was so excited to be the first in line to do this. Thea had clients that day, and she was like really busy and was kind of like, it's okay, we'll do it tomorrow. Like, it doesn't have to be today. It's all right. And Edie told her that she'd been waiting 28 years for that day, and she did not want to wait anymore. So Thea cleared her schedule. She went and she got some flowers, and then they went down to the court and declared their domestic partnership. And it was like a really, really special moment for them. And they were so happy. And it was like nothing could ruin this. So we're going to veer and talk about politics, which is just, of course, my favorite to talk about, especially right now in this lovely world and reality that we are living in. So the 90s were a crazy time, and it's not just because like it's the era of the boy band and the Beanie Baby, right? So in 1993, the same year that Thea and Edie have their domestic partnership, you have the passing of Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy that allowed members of the LGBT community to join the military as long as they were not openly out and did not engage in homosexual activity. The same year, 1993, the Hawaiian Supreme Court ruled that denying same-sex marriage is discrimination, and this launched a large movement for same-sex marriage, not just in Hawaii, but in a lot of places. This isn't the first court case having to do with fighting for gay marriage. There was Singer v. Hara in Washington state that said that the Washington Equal Rights Amendment that prohibited discrimination based on sex and gender prohibited the denial of same-sex marriage, which was not successful. There was also Adams v. Howerton in 1982, where a marriage license was issued in Boulder, Colorado for a same-sex couple, and they were married by a minister, but when Adams petitioned immigration, he was denied. This case was also unsuccessful. And then another big one prior to the 1993 Hawaiian case was DeSanto versus Barnsley in 1984, where two members of a same-sex couple had a ceremony, entered into a common law marriage, and wanted a divorce that would entitle parties to things like alimony, equitable distribution, costs, etc., etc., etc. And it was ruled that they were never married in the first place, so they couldn't have a legal divorce where these things were settled. So you have that happened in Hawaii in 1993, and then a few years later in 1996, there was another Hawaiian Supreme Court case with a new defendant. This was Bear versus Meek. There was a full trial with expert witnesses and the whole shebang, and they ruled that the evidence supporting the denial of same-sex marriage lacked merit, which would then lead to the conclusion that same-sex couples could be issued marriage certificates, and it seemed like that would be put into law. And then the government fucking panicked because the same year they passed probably the worst act for same-sex marriage, the Defense Against Marriage Act. So this act was passed on September 21st, 1996 with the intention to, quote, define and protect the institution of marriage, which they defined marriage as a union between a man and a woman. It also specifies that the word spouse is defined as someone of the opposite gender, so a husband's wife or a wife's husband. In doing so, it denied over 1,000 federal protections to people who were not part of a heterosexual or heteronormative relationship. Cornell Law School goes on to elaborate that this includes access to a partner's employment benefits, the rights to inheritance, joint tax returns, tax exemptions, the right to cohabitate in college and military houses, and recognition of a marriage in and of itself. This also stated that if there were states that recognized same-sex marriages, that didn't mean that those who married there would be recognized in states that did not allow these unions. It also made it that if a couple were to have a child together, only the biological parent had any rights whatsoever. This included having a legal relationship, the ability to take medical leave if their child were to get sick and they weren't able to legally adopt them or get custody of them in cases of separation and or divorce, but divorce wasn't really a thing because marriage wasn't really a thing. And about 40 states enacted bans on same-sex marriage with the argument that same-sex marriage could lead to alternative family formations, incestuous relationships, and polygamy, which is just like such an archaic way of looking at any sexual orientation outside of heterosexuality. Because someone in a same-sex relationship, they're automatically like depraved or whatever, of course, is the idea here. And I mean, that's like where like people in like the 16, 17, 1800s who were identifying as gay were equated to like pedophiles and people who engage in bestiality. And it's like such an archaic way of associating these people just for something that like they didn't choose, you know? So politics aside, for now, let's get back to Edie and Thea. So with all this political climate, there were still states that were passing laws that allowed same-sex couples to get married. The first state was Massachusetts, which ruled that there was not a constitutionally adequate reason to deny a civil marriage between same-sex couples, and this was done in 2004. In 2007, Edie and Thea went to Toronto, Canada to get married. So same-sex marriage had been legal there since 2003. And the state of New York, where they lived, would acknowledge a marriage that happened there, even if it was same-sex marriage. But I read in an interview that Edie did that with Thea's health, that they didn't want to stress her out more than necessary with the travel and everything that needed to be done to get her to Canada. And they had their domestic partnership, which they thought would be enough. But in 2006... Thea was diagnosed with aortic stenosis and was basically told that she was now terminal and she had about a year to live. And Edie recalled that the next morning, Thea woke up, turned to her and said, "Do you still want to get married?" And Edie said yes, and Thea said, "Me too." And they went to Canada with 6 of their friends, 2 best men, 4 best women, and they were so excited to finally be wives to each other after being together for over 40 years at this point. And on May 22nd, 2007, that's what they finally were able to do. Unfortunately, they didn't live long together as married partners because Thea passed away on February 5th, 2009 from complications related to her heart condition. And Edie suffered from a heart attack about a month later. And like, I know it's a medical condition, but it was really like her heart was broken when Thea died, even though it was expected. Now, if Edie and Thea's marriage was legally recognized, then she would have been able to like mourn and do whatever you need to do when a partner dies. She would have also been able to inherit anything or be a beneficiary on life insurance and all like the monetary things that happen when someone dies without anything preventing her from doing so. But because Edie and Thea's marriage was not legally recognized by the United States government, when she died, Edie wasn't eligible for exemption from the estate tax that married couples were able to get. So Edie owed the federal government $363,000. $363,053, and the state of New York $275,528. So a total of $638,581 Edie was expected to pay to the United States government and the New York government. And the reason why she had to pay it, again, is because the government laws like Defense Against Marriage Act that passed in 1996 acknowledged that they were not married. So this was like her inheritance, right? And if they were married, what's mine is yours, you know? So they were basically looked at as roommates and had a fuck ton of taxes to pay and had zero fucking rights. Edie said, quote, "If Thea was Theo, I would not have had to pay. It's heartbreaking. It's just a terrible injustice. And I don't expect that from my country. I think that it's a mistake that has to be corrected. And girl, that statement can apply to so many things today. But we're going to just keep moving on." So Edie decided to sue in 2010, and she got Roberta Kaplan, who went by Robbie, to take her case. Now, Robbie was a lesbian partner at Paul Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison, which was a law firm that had taken on a lot of LGBT cases and did so pro bono, and they took on her case. So they fought this for a couple years. Edie recalled having like a life-size photo of Thea in her home, and she would sit down with the photo or like cuddle up against it and tell her like all about all the progress that was being made in her case and all of that. And in 2013, she had really, really good news for this giant picture of Thea because the Supreme Court voted in her favor 5-4. By the Supreme Court voting this way, this now meant that all married couples, whether they were heteronormative or not, were now fully recognized by the federal government in relation to things like taxes, benefits, and immigration. The late, great, notorious RBG had said before this that there were 2 kinds of marriages, the full marriage and then the sort of skim milk marriage. And Edie and her lawyers and the Supreme Court helped us get that full, fat, whipped cream ready kind of marriage and recognition. And it also meant that the federal government now owed $363,053 plus interest back to Edie. And this led the way to the June 26, 2015 decision that legalized all same-sex couples. And right now, when I am recording this, it is the 7-year anniversary of that decision. And I've just been thinking about it a lot, like the last couple days. I remember that day vividly because we were living in Orlando at the time. My now husband and I, but like at that point, I think he was still just my boyfriend, or we had just gotten engaged. And I had a really terrible day the day before. Like, I don't even remember what happened, but I just remember like just having a really bad day. And so we went to Disney World because we had annual passes, and that was just what we did. I was in a roommate situation that I just wasn't happy in, and so we were trying to be in the house as little as possible. And we like paid like the monthly price just so that we could go to Disney World whenever we wanted to. And we were those disgusting Disney adults, and we were at the park when the news announced the decision, and the entire park was just like full of celebration. And we all got the little like I'm celebrating pins that Disney has, and we wrote love on it, and we were just like so happy to celebrate love. And it was just such a positive time to live in America. And like, for the first time in my life, I think I was like, yeah, I'm proud to be an American. And like, this country has done some really terrible things, but like, we're on the up and up, and we're on the upswing, and like, everything is gonna be okay. And it just isn't that way anymore. Like, Roe v. Wade was overturned 2 days ago. Clarence Thomas and the other conservative judges are trying to overturn Obergefell v. Hodges, which is that 2015 court case that legalized all marriages, whether they're same-sex or not. And I usually have like no problem to just like jump on my soapbox, just like no hesitation to just shit talk everything, and then like give my opinion on political matters and social matters. And I just don't have the energy to do that because I am just sad, and I am angry, and I really hate what's happening, and sitting here and just watching rights just get slowly stripped away. And I'm scared to try to do something about it because I have a child who needs his mom, and I don't know what to do because like, I want to fight, and I want to unleash this like rage that's just building inside of me. And I want to make sure that my child has a better world to live in, and that like all future generations have a better world to live in. But y'all, I'm scared of this government and where it's headed right now, because it isn't just about like pro-life and like preserving the life of a fetus, or like preserving Christian values, even though the last time I checked, although Christianity is the leading religion in the United States, we do not live in a religious oligarchy, and we have separation of church and state. And yet a book written thousands of years ago is dictating these decisions and the availability of my choices. And if you don't want an abortion, don't have one. And if you don't want to marry someone of the same sex, then don't marry them. And yet even saying that can be dangerous because I don't know where this country is heading. But like, learning about Edie Windsor and learning about her fight is giving me strength and inspiration. And it's like even more important to talk about right now, and to highlight stories of like the little guy, or like whatever you want to call them, just taking on the government and being able to be an instrument of change. And Edie Windsor spent the last few years of her life celebrating this like monumental overturning of DOMA and the later on equity of marriage. She toured the country and the entire world was celebrating. And some articles that I read called her the matriarch of the gay rights movement. And Terrence McNally, who is a playwright and was one of her friends, like wrote to her at one point and said, quote, "Thank you for letting us crown you our queen. We never really asked. We just sort of thrust a crown and scepter on you and being so gracious about it. It can't always be easy or comfortable to be Edie Windsor, but I hope Edie Windsor understands how important the other Edie, Queen Edie, is to our community at this moment in our incredible story." And Obama thanked her for her service, and members of the LGBTQIA plus community hugged her on site. I saw a picture of Glenn Close, who was Cruella de Vil, and this amazing actress, just embracing her and being in awe and just speechless at meeting Edie Windsor. And it was just so great that she got to celebrate that. And she even found love again towards the end of her life. She married a woman named Judith Kaysen and was able to actually legally marry her with no issues. And Judith recalled later on about the way that they always just sort of ran into each other at gay rights events and pride events. And when Judith saw Edie for the first time, she was being awarded with a Lifetime Achievement Award, and she fell in love with her at first sight. And they had this adorable courting where Edie sort of always brushed her off a little and was like, "Oh, I hate going to lunches," or whatever, and didn't realize that there was actual interest there, probably because of the 36-year age difference between the two. When they got married, Edie was 87 and Judith was 51, but they were together for a year, and then Edie Windsor died on September 12th, 2017 at the age of 88 in a world that made sense and could be celebrated, even though Donald Trump was president at the time. And this world doesn't make sense anymore. And I can't say that I'm surprised about the decisions and the direction that this country is heading, but it doesn't make sense anymore. And I can't celebrate anything anymore. And I just keep thinking about one of the articles that I read that was written by Edie's wife, Judith, earlier this year in March, about the current political climate and all. And they asked her, what would Edie do? WWED. And Judith said that be honest and stand up and speak up and be brave, because our history is too important not to. And I don't think that that's something that just encompasses the gay rights history and the gay rights movement anymore. I think that that's just all marginalized people at this time, because we're kind of all under attack and all at risk in some way or another. Because I read an article about Texas trying to pass laws that, in addition to the abortion bans and all of that, now they're trying to make gender inequality a thing again, overturn laws that protect gender discrimination and gay rights being overturned in gay marriage, and also overturning the voter rights laws that make sure that people can't be discriminated and not able to vote based on their race or orientation or anything like that. And they're trying to just go back to the, not even the I don't even know, 1800s, prior to the Civil War, where nobody had any rights except for rich white men. And it's just ridiculous. But I think the quote, "Be honest, stand up, speak, and be brave, because our history is too important not to," is a better note to end on than the absolute fuckery that this world has descended into at this point. So that is what I'm choosing to end on. Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review or joining my Patreon. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up. And it just has a completely different meaning now. this is when history is actually watching all of us, and we are at like a precipice of change. And I just hope that everything changes for the better, because we owe that to like the future generations, you know.